Hi, today we are going to read Front Desk by Kelly Yang, Chapter 21. Pounding woke us up at dawn the next day. Ear-splitting pounding, like someone was attacking the front office door with a jackhammer. I jumped out of bed. Mr. Lorenz, one of the customers from the night before, was standing in front of the front office. Quickly, my dad buzzed him in. "My car!" Lorenz shrieked. "It's gone!" Mr. Lorenz's neon green Ford Thunderbird had been taken in the middle of the night. He had parked it right in front of his room, room 5, and when he woke up, it was gone. "We have to find out who did this," I said, turning to my parents. "You think it was one of the other customers?" I immediately grabbed the customer logbook to see who stayed here last night. "Could have been anybody," Mr. Lorenz said. "Somebody could have come in here in the middle of the night and taken off with my car." I made a mental note to add parking lot gate to my wish list. My father picked up the phone. "Hello, Mr. Yao?" my dad said. "Something terrible has happened." Mr. Yao arrived half an hour later. "How could this happen?" he said to my mom and dad, gesturing angrily with his hands. "We don't know," my dad said. "We're just as surprised as you." Mr. Yao picked up the phone and called the police. After that, he went around from room to room, waking up all the customers. "Have you seen a green Ford Thunderbird?" he asked them, peering suspiciously into their rooms. One of the guests said he did hear some noise at around 3 a.m., like someone was trying to start their car. Mr. Yao turned to my dad. "Did you see anybody leave at 3 a.m.?" he asked. My dad sheepishly admitted that he didn't know. He had been sleeping, to which Mr. Yao frowned and said, "Stop sleeping." Mr. Yao then asked us if there were any customers who left without checking out. My dad and I went to check if anyone had gone in the middle of the night, and sure enough, when we went around, we found 5 keys. We gave Mr. Yao numbers of the rooms and the names of the customers. Mr. Yao wanted to know what the customers looked like. I tried to describe them the best I could. "Let's see. Mr. Roberto had a mustache," I said, "but it wasn't one of those long, archy ones. It was a small and tidy one. And Mrs. Robinson, she was about the same height as my mom, a little taller." I closed my eyes, trying to recall any other details about her. She had long, curly black hair past her shoulders, not in braids, like some other black women. I said. Mr. Yao's eyes bulged. "Wait a minute. She's black?" He yelled. "I thought I told you not to rent to bad people." My throat went dry. I could hear the sound of my breathing hard and fast. "You said bad people, not black people." "Any idiot knows black people are dangerous." Mr. Yao said. "That's not true." I was stunned. "Hank's not dangerous. For one," I narrowed my eyes at Mr. Yao, "you're the one who's dangerous." "Mia," my dad said. Nervously, my dad turned to Mr. Yao. "Sir, we can't judge someone based on their skin color. It isn't right. This is America." Mr. Yao snorted. "If you really believe that, you're even dumber than I thought," he said. "Clearly, you have no idea how this country really works." The sound of police cars pulling in made us look up. "What's going on here?" the police officers asked when they stepped in. There were 2 officers, both male and both white. They had a lot of things on their uniforms, sticks hanging from their belts, radios, and walkie-talkies, which they talked into as they walked up to the front desk, and guns. I stared at the guns. Mr. Yao quickly filled them in on what happened. From the familiar way they talked with him, it seemed like they knew him. I wondered if the cops had been at the Calvista before. Mr. Yao handed them the list of customers who had left in the middle of the night. He told them he thought it was Mrs. Robinson who stole Mr. Lorenzo's car. He went so far as to circle Mrs. Robinson's name and write the word black next to it. "And where is Mrs. Robinson now?" the officers asked. "She left, but I really don't think," I started to say. The officers cut me off with a sharp shh. They only wanted to hear from Mr. Yao. Mr. Yao proceeded to tell the officers about the other customers. They seemed particularly interested in hearing about the Weekleys. "Are they home? Can we interview them?" "Absolutely," Mr. Yao said, leading the way outside. The Weekleys were outside talking about what happened. At the sight of Mr. Yao walking over, Hank quickly moved his tomato plant into his room. Mr. Yao did not like Hank growing plants outside his room. He said Hank hadn't rented that space. The cops walked up to the Weekleys. "We'd like to ask you guys some questions," the cops said. "How long have you been living here?" "About 3 months," Billy Bob said. "I was staying over at Days before." One of the officers turned to Hank and asked, "And you?" "About 6 months," Hank told him. The officer jotted it down. "Do you have a job?" he asked Hank. "Yeah, I work over at the gas station on Orange and Knott," he said. "What's this about?" Fred asked. "You think we did it?" Mrs. Q put a hand to her chest and let out a shrill, "Good God!" "Sir, ma'am, we're not saying that. We're just asking questions," the cop said. "But you're asking the wrong people," I interjected. They ignored me. As they carried on interrogating the Weekleys, I kept trying to interrupt. But every time I tried, I tugged on their shirt. The police officer said, "Please don't touch me." Finally, they told the Weekleys they could all go back to their rooms. All the Weekleys started walking back to their rooms. One of the officers pulled Hank aside. "Except for you," he said. "Why me?" asked Hank. "Because I said so," the cop said, staring Hank down. The Weekleys looked at to hold something for him. "Doesn't have to be big." I shook my head. "No." The officer seemed displeased with my answer and frowned. "I'm sorry. I'm going to need you to go back inside with your parents." "Hank's a good guy," I yelled at the officer as the officer took my arm and dragged me away. The whole time I looked back at Hank and at the frustration and fury in his eyes as he said the words over and over. I didn't do it. I sat with my nose pressed up against the window, watching the police interrogate Hank. Several times I ran outside, only to be escorted back in. "See,